Yeah, and Christopher, to answer your question, I mean, citizen science projects are able to be done anywhere around the world. So that's one of the beauties of them. And so we could definitely work on trying to figure out how to expand our reach with this particular project we're hoping to do next summer.
Welcome, everybody. My name's Cassie Soping, and I'm with Globe Mission Mosquito, the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and serving as the host of today's webinar. And I am joined by two of my work colleagues, Dr. Rusty Lowe, Rusty, and she's the mistress of all mosquito writing activities. That would be Ms. Liz Burke, joining us from Alaska.
Yep. Hello.
And we have our featured presenter, Dr. Allison Parker. So I'll advance the slide. And I generically, Allison, took the liberty of saying, what do we know about mosquitoes? And I'm so glad that you're here to help us understand what they are.
So yeah, today we are going to be talking about mosquitoes, basically everything you need to know about them, and how to, if you're an intern, how to design a control experiment. And if you are just a member of the general public, how to create a mosquito trap to put in your yard so that you can try to not have them biting you all the time. So just the basic outline for the talk today. First, we're going to go over some basic mosquito ecology so that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to talk about how to identify the three main groups of mosquitoes that we would come into contact with, just in general. And we'll also talk about my favorite mosquito species. Then we will talk about designing a research project, and then go over an example or two examples of research projects that we do in my lab. And then we'll finish up with how to protect yourself from mosquitoes and how to make a mosquito trap. And then we will end with questions. But if at any point you have questions, feel free to let me know, put it in the chat, and I will be looking at the chat as I go through, and I will stop and answer any questions you have. So the first thing is, why study mosquitoes? So in my research lab, we study mosquitoes and ticks, but today we're just talking about mosquitoes. And the reason we study mosquitoes is because they are the most dangerous animal on the planet. They spread a wide range of diseases, including malaria, dengue, chikungunya, Zika, West Nile viruses. Some of these also impact horses, like West Nile, Eastern equine encephalitis. If you have a dog, your dog could get dog heartworm from mosquitoes. So they spread a wide range of diseases. And not every mosquito species spreads each of these diseases. So knowing which mosquitoes we have in our area, wherever it is you live, is important so that we know what diseases we need to worry about. Because for most of these diseases, especially if they impact humans, we don't have vaccines for a lot of these diseases. And so the best way to prevent the spread of the disease is to actually control the mosquito themselves. And so understanding basic mosquito ecology is really the key in this endeavor. And we're going to see an increase in the spread of these mosquito-borne diseases due to moving some of these mosquito species around the planet because of climate change. So as it gets warmer in certain regions, we'll be able to have mosquitoes that couldn't live in those areas expanding where we used to typically find them into new regions. And as we go through more urbanization, we have certain mosquito species that are really well adapted to living where we live. And so we'll see an expansion of those mosquito species as well. So let's talk about mosquito ecology first. Mosquitoes have a complex life cycle. So they have the adult part of their life cycle, which is what we're most familiar with. They're the organisms that fly around. The females are biting us. Only the female mosquitoes blood feed, and that is because they need to get the blood so that they have enough nutrients to produce their eggs. The males and females, when the females aren't blood feeding, the males and females actually drink nectar from plants to have enough energy to sustain their cellular processes. And so if a female mosquito drinks our blood or any organism's blood, she then takes about 72 hours to make her eggs, and then she will lay her eggs on the surface or near an area of standing water. The eggs will hatch, and you could see down here in this first picture, these are mosquito larvae. The mosquito larvae will go through 4 different life instars or life stages, basically, in the water where they're getting larger. Then they will turn into the pupae, which my students call sea dragons because they look like little dragons wiggling around in the water. And that's when they're going through metamorphosis. So that's, if you think of a caterpillar goes into a cocoon to turn into a butterfly, mosquitoes go into this pupal form when they're going from that worm-like larval stage to the adult stage. And then they'll emerge as adults, they'll mate, and the life cycle continues. And there's over 3,000 different species of mosquitoes found around the planet. There are approximately 176 species of mosquitoes in the United States alone. And just another example, there's over 88 species of mosquitoes in Africa. The reason mosquitoes are so challenging to control is because the larvae can be found in a wide range of aquatic habitats. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later in the talk. But finding out where the larvae are can be really challenging. Controlling those aquatic habitats is challenging. And then the adults fly around, so then that's even more challenging to control. So this complex life cycle makes them very, very, very hard to control. And that's why it's important to understand this life cycle. Now, this is the general life cycle for all mosquitoes, but there are some differences based on the different types of mosquitoes you might be encountering. So our 3 main genera, our 3 main groups of mosquitoes are Aedes, Anopheles, and Culex. And so we're going to go through these 3 groups. We'll start by comparing the larval stages of these 3 groups, especially if you're using the Globe Observer app. It will ask you some of these questions about the larvae. So seeing some pictures can be helpful. And then we'll talk about some differences in the adults. But these are just some general figures about the different 3 main groups of mosquitoes. So we're going to start with the larvae. And so we have our Aedes larvae and our Culex larvae look similar. So when we're talking about larvae, we're thinking about this worm-like creature in these aquatic habitats. And Aedes and Culex larvae have what's called a siphon, or what my students call a butt straw. And basically, it's this little tube that we see coming off of the end of the larvae, and that is where they breathe. And so Aedes and Culex will sit in this more perpendicular fashion, as you can see in these 2 lower pictures. And so they're going to be sitting perpendicular to the surface of the water, breathing oxygen through that siphon or air tube. Anopheles look very, very different. They sit parallel to the surface of the water because they do not have that air straw. Instead, they have little fan-like structures on their body, which help them bring in oxygen. So they look very different. So it's very easy to tell the difference between an Anopheles versus the Culex and Aedes, which look much more similar. But our Aedes mosquitoes tend to have a shorter, stockier air tube or siphon, and the Culex tend to have a longer, slimmer air tube or siphon. So if you see any of these on the surface of the water, if you say you look over a bucket of water, you'll be able to tell the Anopheles because they'll be laying flat, and then your Aedes and Culex will be more perpendicular as they're resting. So then our adults are, if you actually see an adult landing and resting, you can usually tell which of these 3 groups this mosquito belongs to. So the Aedes adults are usually dark in color, and they tend to be either dark brown or all the way to black, depending on the species. And they tend to have stripes on them in some sort of pattern. So it's pretty easy to see them even if they're flying around, especially this top mosquito, Aedes albopictus. It's native to Africa, but it's invasive in a lot of parts of the world. It's called the Asian tiger mosquito because it has such distinctive stripes. But below, Aedes japonicus is another Aedes species. Again, you could see it has stripes on its legs. It has other striping patterns on its body. And Aedes, as you can see in these pictures, they tend to rest parallel to the surface of whatever they're resting on, whether it's a plant or if it's you. They tend to rest parallel with their head pointed down, especially if they're feeding. Anopheles look very different from a lot of the other mosquito groups that we're going to see. Anopheles have much longer legs, as you can see in these two pictures. Their legs tend to be a little bit thinner, more spindly, and their wings have different patterns on them, as you can see in the lower picture, and that's one of their defining characteristics. Most other mosquito species don't have patterns on their wings themselves, and they rest at an angle. Their body is at a straight angle to whatever surface they're resting on, so you could usually tell just by a glance that they're resting a little bit differently than everybody else. Culex, people like to say that they're brown and boring because they're usually just brown. There's not much pattern on them. They rest similar to our Aedes, where their bodies are parallel to the surface of the water. And that's a little bit different from these other two groups of mosquitoes is that they lay egg rafts on the surface of the water, so they lay all their eggs at one time. So you could see in this lower picture down here, that's a female. She's laying 100 to 300 eggs at one time. So controlling these mosquitoes is important because when she lays her eggs, and if you don't take care of that habitat, you're going to have 100 to 300 mosquitoes flying around on your property, which you don't want. So those are the three main groups of mosquitoes that we care about in mosquito control, because they're the three main groups that spread different diseases. But I don't want to go through this whole talk without talking about my favorite mosquito species. And most people say, how could you have a favorite mosquito species? These are mosquitoes. They're gross. They're terrible. Well, this is my favorite mosquito species. This group of mosquitoes are called the elephant mosquitoes. They're in the genus Toxorynchites. And depending on where you live around the world, you'll have different species of these, but they're all relatively similar and they all do the same thing. The larvae are really cool. They're big and red. Every summer when we collect some of these, my students name them all different types of names that have to do with things that are red, like Clifford the Big Red Dog or Elmo, or different, whatever they could think of that has to do with something that's red. They're very, very distinctive larvae, and they're really cool because the larvae, as you could see in this one picture, the elephant mosquito larvae eat other mosquito larvae. That's what they eat. That's what they feed on. And so they're really great if you have one in a bucket or something, because they're going to eat all the other larvae. This is really good for us as well, because these larvae get so much nutrients, so much protein from eating these other mosquito larvae that the females do not blood feed. They just feed on nectar and they have enough nutrients to lay their eggs. And they're called elephant mosquitoes, if you look in the second picture on the bottom, because their mouth part has this curve in it, which makes you think of the trunk of an elephant. And they're also very large mosquitoes. So that's where they get their name. And they tend to have some cool metallic colors on them, blues and golds and things like that. So that's why they're my favorite, because they don't blood feed and they eat other mosquito larvae. People always ask, well, why don't we just put these out everywhere, right? Why don't we just release a bunch of these and then get rid of all the other mosquito larvae? We've tried that. Unfortunately, the females are very picky. They will only lay eggs, 1 to 2 eggs in each habitat, because they want to make sure their offspring have enough food to eat. And so we can't use them for control because they just don't lay enough eggs in each container or each aquatic habitat to really get rid of all the mosquito larvae, unfortunately. But they're super cool if you ever find them. So now that we've gone over a few of the different types of mosquitoes, let's talk about where we might find the larval mosquitoes. We're going to talk about the larval mosquitoes, one, because that's what I study, but also because they're easier to control than the adults, which are flying around. So we're going to focus for the rest of the talk on mosquito larval habitats. Okay. So we have our mosquito larval habitats. There's 3 main aquatic habitats that we'll find mosquitoes. The first are container breeding mosquitoes. And so we find those mosquito larvae in container type habitats. So a natural container is something like a tree hole or a depression in a rock. We call those rock holes, where water will naturally collect. And that would be a natural container habitat for mosquitoes. humans are really, really good at making containers. And so man-made containers are really the primary source for a lot of container breeding mosquitoes now. And in my lab, we study these container breeding mosquitoes. And we'll talk more about these container habitats in the next few slides. We also have floodwater mosquitoes, which will lay their eggs in temporary pools or ponds that are created by rain. So if you have, for example, a place in your yard that holds water after it rains, that would be a great habitat for a floodwater mosquito to lay their eggs. So if you notice in your yard that you have a lot of mosquitoes out after it rains and you have that wet place in your yard, that's probably where they're coming from. Other places for floodwater mosquitoes could be ditches and things that flood after it rains, irrigated fields. Any place that holds water temporarily after a heavy rain is considered a floodwater habitat. And then we have permanent water mosquitoes, and they're going to lay their eggs in places that are always going to be holding water. So near the edges of lakes and ponds, among plants in swamps and marshes or permanent wetlands. So these are mosquitoes that unless you have a body of water that's a permanent body of water that's relatively large by your house, you're not really coming into contact with these permanent water mosquitoes. So Jesse asked, can I purchase elephant mosquito eggs? Not that I know of. You also want to be careful if you're going to try to purchase these, that you're purchasing elephant mosquito adults, larvae, or eggs that are of the species that are found in your area, because you don't want to introduce a new species that's not there. So you also would have to check on that, because the species that I have in Northern Kentucky are different than the species of elephant mosquitoes that we have in Africa, for example. They're closely related, but different. So that would be something else you need to check on if you did find a place that was selling these. They're pretty hard to rear in a laboratory setting. So I'm going to guess you probably can't buy their eggs. We've tried to rear them before and it never works, unfortunately. So those are the three main types of habitats where we might find mosquito larvae, but we're going to focus on container habitats because that's what most of us would be come in contact with on a regular basis. So these are all examples of natural larval container habitats. So tree holes that are places maybe where a branch fell off or where roots kind of formed a depression. These are really great habitats because they are holding a lot of detritus, so leaves that have fallen off the trees and things like that, and they make a lot of nutrients, so a very nutrient-rich habitat. Same with the rock holes. There are mosquitoes who are actually specialized in living, the larvae are specialized at living in these rock hole communities. But that's also an example of a natural habitat. And then any type of depression in the ground. I've even seen natural habitats made from, the paw prints of animals or like from horse hoof tracks if it's been muddy enough. So any type of like muddy depression, again, is going to be nutrient rich. Those are all perfectly good natural larval habitats for container breeding mosquitoes. Most of us probably don't have these in our yards, or especially if you're living in an urban area, you probably aren't going to come in contact with a lot of these. If you live in a more rural area, then you might see these more often. And later in the talk, we'll talk about what you can do to treat these habitats to get rid of mosquitoes if you have these natural habitats around where you live. But most of the habitats that container breeding mosquitoes lay their eggs in are man-made habitats. And these habitats range from large things such as rain barrels and garbage cans, stormwater catch basins that are on the side of the road where water rushes into when it rains, large habitats like that. We can have medium-sized habitats like tires, which we're doing a lot of research on in my lab right now, buckets or watering cans that people have neglected, or flower pots that are holding water. Clogged rain gutters on your house are a huge problem where we see lots of mosquitoes if people don't clean them out, because there's lots of good food and there's water in there. And because it's high up over our heads, we don't think about that as a potential place for mosquitoes. And some mosquitoes are really good at finding very small aquatic habitats. So, some water in a tarp, or people like to put these corrugated downspout extensions on their gutters so that the water rushes away from their house when it rains. But though that corrugated V, that's enough water for some mosquito species to develop. A bottle can top, just the top of a bottle, that could be enough for some mosquito species. So we have a wide range of container habitats that we use as humans, or that we, leave out on accident, that are perfect places for mosquitoes to breed. And so when you're thinking about controlling mosquitoes, trying to get rid of these container habitats that are man-made is really what we're looking for to try to reduce a lot of these mosquito species in areas where we live. So when you're thinking about designing your own research project, there's some things you need to think about. So these are for the interns, you guys have to think about what you're going to do, what you're going to study. So here's some different types of questions you can try to answer. So that's the first thing you want to do. What am I trying to figure out? What's my problem? So maybe you're interested in, are there more mosquito larvae in containers that are in the shade versus not the shade, right? In unshaded areas. And then you have to think about what kind of shade, right? Is it a tree canopy cover for your shade? Or is it a structural shade, maybe from a building, for example? Or is there a bridge somewhere by you, right? So you need to think about that kind of stuff. Are you interested in different types of containers? Is there a difference between a big 5-gallon bucket and a small flower pot? What kind of containers are you interested in? Or do you want your containers to all be the same thing? We need to put some nutrients in these containers. So do you want to have plant matter, like grass clippings or dead leaves? What type of plants? Or do you want to use a different nutrient source? For example, you can use fish flakes as food. Or you could, if you have a pet at home, you could use your pet's food, put some of that in the water. So what kind of nutrient source? How are you going to attract your mosquitoes? Are you interested in the height of the container? You can have the same size container, but if it's, on a windowsill versus on the ground, is that going to change, what mosquitoes you're seeing or how many mosquitoes you're seeing? The possibilities are really endless on what you're trying to ask if you're thinking about container habitats. So you have lots of different options. And I'll show you some examples on the next few slides. The next thing you need to think about is, how are you going to test your question? So you're going to want to have replicates. So I always suggest using 3 replicates, especially because sometimes something might happen to one, so then you still have 2. So that allows you to say, well, I'm seeing this trend in my containers on my windowsill and on the ground at this part of my house. Maybe you could use a friend's house or a different part of your house. Are you going to see the same trend in a different location, right? So that would be 2 replicates. So you want to try to have 3 groups if possible. You need to figure out what type of containers you're going to use. Are they going to be the same, or are they going to be different? If they're different, make sure you have those different containers. Maybe you're interested in a flower pot and a flower pot saucer that sits underneath the flower pot usually. So are you going to have 2 different ones, but then everything else should be the same? Or do you want to have the same containers and maybe you change the amount of water that's in them, or if they're in shade or not in shade? So how are you going to make your water attractive to your females? So you could use things like grass clippings, dead leaves. You could use fish flakes. You could use pet food. You could use all different types of things. You could try out all different things just to see what might be attractive for mosquitoes to get the females to come and lay their eggs. What data are you going to collect and how often? Are you going to check every day? Are you going to check every 3 days? Are you going to check once a week? So make sure you know what you're going to do, and that's part of your plan before you start your experiment. Because the worst thing to do is you put this out and then you have to go on a family vacation. That's not going to work, right? So make sure you're planning out your experiment. And then how are you going to analyze your data? So what's going to happen? How are you going to show everybody else the results of your experiment? So those are all things to keep in mind when you're trying to plan your research project. So there is a way that you can actually get some ideas by using this EREN-NEON flexible learning project. The link is down at the bottom of this slide. This is basically, it's for school classes, like biology classes, environmental science classes, college ecology classes. And I designed this during COVID. So it tells you how to basically design an experiment at home. And so it gives you background on mosquitoes. It tells you how to build a mosquito emergence trap. So if you wanted to see what species of mosquitoes you had and you wanted to see what they looked like as adults, there's a picture of the trap where you have your aquatic habitat on the bottom, and then on the top, when the adults emerge, they'll fly up and get stuck in the top. So you can actually look at what the adults look like if you wanted to do that. There is a supply kit, so it'll tell you everything you need. And then there's also on there some taxonomic keys for you to help you identify mosquitoes to a little bit more in depth than if you were using the Globe Observer app. But that's fine too, depending on what level of identification you want to go to. And there's two different experiments that you could try if you want, or you can develop your own. The first is looking at female oviposition or egg laying choice. So you can look at that and see, are there questions in there that are interesting to you? So you could do that. There's also looking at mosquito diversity across an anthropogenic impact gradient or a human use gradient. So going from more urban habitat to suburban to rural. So you could try doing something like that if you have access to different sites. But that is a great place to look to try to get some ideas on how to design your experiment. Some gives you an idea of what supplies you might need for your experiment. So now I'm going to show you an example experiment that we did in my lab. So in this example, we were interested in how the volume of water in identical containers impact egg-laying choice by our Culex females. And remember, I said the Culex females are a little bit different. They lay egg grafts, so we can use one egg graft to count as one female. And this picture here with the paintbrush, that's actually an egg graft on top of a paintbrush. So you don't need any fancy equipment, just a paintbrush, and you just dunk your paintbrush in to collect your egg grafts. And we had, as you could see in the second picture, 3 different levels of water. We had 6 liters, 12 liters, and 18 liters. And in this case, we used grass. That was the way we attracted the females. So we used grass clippings in our water to attract our females. And we used white 5-gallon buckets. So they were all the same buckets. So we were just looking at the level of water, the volume. And then we collected the eggs every day for 12 weeks. You don't have to collect them for that long. That's just what we were doing for our project. And then this is an example of a graph that you might want to make to show the results of your experiment. And so you could see here that on our y-axis, we had our volume of grass infusion in our buckets, 6 liters, 12 liters, or 18 liters. And then on our y-axis, we had our number of egg grafts that we collected per day on average. And so you can see that our 6-liter volume collected the least amount of egg grafts compared to our 12 and 18 liters. And so that showed us that these Culex mosquitoes that we were interested in, because in our region, they're the ones that are transmitting West Nile virus, they really don't like containers with small amounts of water. So if we're trying to control mosquitoes and we have limited resources, we really want to target containers that have more water in them, because those are the ones where we're going to see these Culex larvae. You can let your eggs hatch, and you can actually look at the larvae themselves. It's really up to you. So you could design your data collection however you want. So in this case, we looked at eggs, but for you, it might be easier to actually let the eggs hatch and then see which groups of mosquitoes you have. So that's an example of a project that one of my students designed that we did. I'm going to talk about another one that might be a little bit more challenging for you guys to do at home, but just to give you another idea of a type of project that you could do. So in this case, we were looking at the types of mosquitoes that are in discarded tires, because discarded tires that people just throw into the woods are a major problem for mosquito control, because tires hold water for a long time. Lots of leaves and things fall into them, so they're a great habitat for mosquito larvae. So we've been doing this project we did this part of the project for 2 years. And so we were looking at urban tires and rural tires. So we had parks that were in urban areas and parks that were in rural areas to see if there were differences in the mosquitoes we found in tires. And we surveyed every site once a week. So in this case, we just went once a week and collected the larvae and the pupae from the tires. So you might want to go once a week. In the last project, we went every day. And then we also added adult collecting using 2 adult traps, which you won't be able to do at home, but we were just making sure we knew what was going on with the adults as well. And then we identified all of our mosquitoes. So the results from this study, you could see on our x-axis, we have juveniles and adults. And then on our y-axis, we have the average number of mosquitoes we collected from our rural sites compared to our urban sites. And we found more larvae and pupae in our rural parks than we did in our urban parks, but we actually collected more adults in the urban parks than we did in the rural parks. We're still not quite sure why that's happening, but that might be because there's more predators and mosquitoes in rural areas, or they didn't need to be as close to the tires after the adults came out because they could go find more animals in the woods to feed on. But those were some of the results that we found. So even just looking at these differences in the amount of canopy cover that we have, we're seeing that we do tend to see more mosquito juveniles, or the larvae and pupae, in places where we have more canopy cover compared to in our urban parks, which have, as you could see in the lower picture, a lot less canopy cover. So we're following up, I guess we could look at species diversity. So we also identified all of our mosquitoes, and you could see on the left side, these are the mosquitoes we collected from our tires, and we collected almost 10,000 mosquitoes from our tires, and we identified all of them. And you could see we had a lot of different species. We actually had more than we see here because our other species, there was just a few of them, so they made up a very small percentage. But you could see that we had Culex species, we had Aedes species, we even had some Toxorhynchides, those elephant mosquitoes. We did have some Anopheles species. You're not going to find as many Anopheles species in container habitats, especially in the United States, but you will see some. And then we saw some differences with our adults, where some of the species that we collected in our traps for adults were more common as adults than they were in our tires, showing that they're laying their eggs in other places as well, which makes sense. But you could just see all these different types of species that we have. So Christopher wants to know about how we identified the mosquitoes from our traps. So for the larval mosquitoes, we can identify them if they're Anopheles or something else pretty easily, just by looking to see if they have that siphon, that air tube. And then the adults, and then what we do is we basically take the larvae and we put them under a microscope and look for very specific little hairs and things on their bodies. Let me see if I have a good picture. Yeah, okay, so I'll go back a few slides to show you what those hairs might look like. All right, so if we go back to these 3 major mosquito genera, if you look at the pictures of the larvae, especially for the Anopheles and the Culex, you could see that there's hairs coming off different parts of their body. And we actually look at these little hairs. We look at their antennae and there's defining characteristics for all these mosquitoes. And if you look at them under a microscope, you can see all these different defining characteristics. Same thing for the adults. For the adults, we will look at the patterns. Let me go I'll go to the adult slide. But if you look like for the 80s, you could see on the thorax, that's the part of their body that's attached to their head. You can see that they have different striping patterns, especially for the 80s. So we look at that. For the anopheles, we actually look at the patterns on their wings. The culex are actually the most challenging to identify. Adult mosquitoes have scales on them that make these different patterns. And for the culex, a lot of times the scales that we need to look at fall off when they're in a container habitat, or when we're raising them to adults. So yeah, we look at all these things under the microscope. Once you get to know which mosquitoes are common where you live, I can actually look at these adults without using a microscope and usually tell what they are. But that's because there's about 6 species that we see regularly, and they're all pretty distinct. So I can usually tell the difference. But you can use scientific taxonomic keys, which will help you actually go through the different defining characteristics to get down to the genus level and then down to the species level. And if you want to talk to me more about that, I can point you in the right direction for taxonomic keys for Sweden. I have ones for North America in particular. But yeah, it's looking at these defining characteristics. Yeah, some of the things my students, their least favorite thing to do in the lab is sit at the microscope and look at all this stuff because they prefer to be outside. But yeah, that's how we identify the mosquitoes. But you can use the Globe Observer app to help you identify the larvae, at least down to genus. That's a great question. So what we're doing now with the tires is we're actually trying to figure out if we can use this Ovolante trap to control mosquitoes. So we have our tires that have been out. This is their 3rd year being outside. They just sit outside all year. They're just naturally colonized with whatever leaves fall into them, whatever water we get from the rain. So we have those out at 5 sites, just sitting there. So we added Ovolante traps, and they look similar to this picture on the bottom. Ours don't have that downspout on them. But basically all it is it's a tire that's cut in half and kind of squished together. And the idea is we're trying to see in this project is, do the female mosquitoes care more? Do they prefer these just naturally discarded tires that we might find in the built environment? Or do they prefer these Ovolante traps? Because what we want to know that at least they don't have a preference. Because what we're going to do in the future, if we see in Northern Kentucky that they're laying their eggs in these traps, because they've been tested in Mexico and they work, but we don't know if they work for our mosquitoes in Northern Kentucky. If they work, what we're going to do next summer is we're actually going to do a citizen science project where we give these traps out to members of the public, and then we monitor to make sure they're using them correctly. Because the worst thing to do is to give people mosquito control tools and then they don't use them properly, and then we have even more mosquitoes in the area. That is the opposite of what we're hoping for. So we're going to be piloting that next summer in the Northern Kentucky region to see if people will use them properly over the course of the whole, for us, summer. Since it gets so cold here in the winter, we don't have mosquitoes. So that's what we're working on now. Those are a bunch of my students collecting larvae and pupae from our tires. They're wearing their tick collecting suits. That's why they're all in those white suits. So that's one of the projects we're working on right now. So hopefully next summer I can tell you what the results are, and hopefully we have these deployed in people's yards. So what are some ways to control mosquitoes in your own yard or wherever you live? So we're going to talk about what you could do in your yard. Then I'll talk about how you can control mosquitoes so you don't get bit on yourself when you're out. And then we'll talk about how to make a mosquito trap. So the first thing that you could do is source reduction. This is removing any standing water from your yard. This might be dumping out buckets, watering cans, flower pots or flower pot saucers, any type of container habitat that can hold water. So anything that you can dump out after it rains, or if you don't use it a lot, flip it over, for example, if you're not using that container. That's a great way to prevent mosquitoes from laying eggs in your yard. If you have a place in your yard that holds water after it rains, you can look into installing a rain garden to help reduce that swampy, wet area in your yard with plants that are water tolerant. And then they basically will suck up all the water, and then you won't have that wet spot in your yard anymore. So that gets rid of those floodwater mosquitoes, so a different group of mosquitoes. So this top picture is a picture of a small rain garden that somebody installed in their yard. And their rain barrel in the background, actually, when it gets too full, they can open it up and it'll drain down into this rain garden. And then keeping your rain gutters and rain barrels clean and draining properly. So making sure you don't have a lot of debris in them so that, especially your gutters can't, if they're clogged and aren't draining, they can hold water. That's not great. Same thing with rain barrels. People don't always realize that some mosquito species really like rain barrels. And so if you're not draining them regularly, using that water, making sure it's clean and there's not a lot of dead leaves, even just on the surface, on the top mesh part, that's really important to do that. And then if there's places that you can't get rid of the standing water, say you have a small little fish pond, but you don't have any fish in it, for example, or you have, some sort of like drainage system, and that drain will hold some water after it rains. Use BTI, which BTI stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, subspecies Israeliensis. And this is the best way to control mosquito larvae. BTI is Bacillus thuringiensis is a naturally occurring bacteria that we find in soil. And scientists have used it and figured out that certain subspecies are very good at attacking only certain types of insects. So we have a naturally occurring bacteria, so it's not a chemical. BTI in particular, because you might have heard of BT other something else, but BTI in particular only targets mosquitoes, black flies, and fungus gnat larvae. So if you have a small pond or something with no fish in it, you might have dragonfly larvae. The dragonflies will be fine. If your dog drinks from that water that has the BTI in it, your dog will be fine. You could drink from it. I wouldn't suggest drinking from water that's sitting outside, but you could drink from it, you would be fine. So our beneficial insects are going to be okay. Large animals will be fine. So it is a great tool to use. You can buy it on, at the store, on Amazon. You could buy them in two different forms. The first is the mosquito dunk, which is that donut looking thing. So those are for larger bodies of water. You can break them up into smaller pieces as needed. Or you could use the mosquito bits, which are basically little pellets, which are better for smaller bodies of standing water. Or if you have a kind of a floodplain in your yard, I suggest using the bits over the dunk. But BTI is a great way to control mosquito larvae if you have any standing water that you can't remove from your yard. And BTI will come back in a few slides. So that's what to do in your yard. If you're out, say, on a hike or you're going camping, you're going to be outside. I know in my neighborhood, there's a ton of mosquitoes. So even when I go outside, and if you're in the United States, an Environmental Protection Agency, EPA approved insect repellent, or whatever country you're in, look to see if your government agency has some sort of website like this. In the United States, we've started adding these repellency awareness graphics onto our insecticide bottles. And so, or insect repellent bottles. And so they'll tell you things like, does it work for just mosquitoes? Does it work for mosquitoes and ticks, or just ticks? And then it will also tell you how long it works for, so that you know when you need to reapply it. So that's one thing that you can look for that's starting to become more common when you go to the store to buy an insect repellent. If it doesn't have one of these labels, maybe don't buy it. The other thing that you can do is to treat your clothes with repellent before going outside. You can buy permethrin treated clothing, or you can buy permethrin spray, which is permethrin is a naturally occurring insecticide. It's made from chrysanthemum plants. And so that is something that you can spray on your clothes. You don't spray it on your body, but you can spray it on your clothes, let your clothes dry, and then your clothes are usually good for a few weeks if you don't wash them to wear outside. Or you could use an insect repellent that has DEET and spray that on your clothes. DEET isn't going to kill any insects like permethrin will, but it will, it deters them. It makes it harder for mosquitoes and ticks to smell you. When you're trying to determine which insect repellent is right for you, if you're in the United States, or even if you're not, you could look this up. The EPA has an insect repellent list to help you find which insect repellent is right for you. So you could click different options, and then this chart will come up. It will tell you the name of the product, the hours that you're protected for mosquitoes and also for ticks. It also tells you the active ingredient, which could be really important if you are looking for something that's naturally occurring, or maybe you have sensitivity to certain chemicals or something. So you could see that and some other information, but those first few columns are really helpful, I think. So if you're looking for different repellents, trying to figure out what's best for you or your family, that's where I would go, that website. And then finally, how do you make your own mosquito trap? So if you really want to try to get rid of mosquitoes in your yard, you can actually make a trap and put it in your yard or even on your windowsill of if you have an apartment, for example, to try to get rid of mosquitoes. And it's pretty cheap to do. So the supplies you'll need some sort of container. So it could be something like a 5-gallon bucket, like is pictured up top, but it could be something as small as a to-go soup container. It could be very tiny. It doesn't need to be large. You're going to need some sort of substrate for especially the 80s females to lay eggs on. If you're using something like a 5-gallon bucket, go to your hardware store and get, which is next to the 5-gallon bucket pictured here, a paint stick. They usually will give 1 or 2 to you for free. If you have a smaller container like this, you can use a popsicle stick. So really very simple, just something that will sit diagonally across your container. Then you need some sort of plant matter, dried grass, dried leaves, hay works as well. And you will put that in your bucket to make nutrients for the mosquitoes. Then you're going to want to buy BTI. So either the dunks or the bits, either one, it doesn't really matter. The bits would probably work better in this case because you don't have large amounts of water. But if the dunks are easier for you to purchase, then get those. And then if you have a large container, it's optional to get some chicken wire or wide mesh hardware cloth to use. That's more to prevent animals like chipmunks or birds or mice from falling into your containers. Or if you have small children around, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, says that even 5-gallon buckets are for small children a risk for drowning. So it's good to cover them. So covering them with a wide mesh so the mosquitoes can still get in, but small animals and small children can't. Or your dogs can't get into them. That's optional for larger containers. So what you want to do is you want to fill your container about halfway up with water, whatever size it is, halfway up is about the right amount. Then you want to add your dried plant matter, whether that's grass or leaves, hay, and you're just going to want to push it down into the water. And basically what you're doing is you're making tea out of it. You're steeping these plants so that their nutrients are basically coming out into the water and making a really nice habitat for attracting your female mosquitoes to lay their eggs. You're going to want to let that sit for 2 to 3 days. Ideally, you want to cover it with the top so that mosquitoes aren't getting in there yet, because you're basically steeping or making that tea, or we call it an infusion. After that, you're going to want to add your BTI into your container. And make sure you look on the back of the package for the BTI. It'll tell you how many days it'll last for. The mosquito dunks, even if you use part of it, will last for about 30 days. The bits last for about 7 to 14 days. So you're going to want to make sure you're using the right amount of BTI on a regular basis, depending on which type of version you're using. So add your substrate, whether that's a popsicle stick, paint, one of those paintbrush or those paint sticks. It could be a regular stick from a tree, just something for the females to land on, check out the habitat, and for some of them to lay their eggs on. If you are worried about animals or small children getting in your container, especially if it's a large container, then you can cover it if you want, like you see in that one picture. And then you just let it sit there, and that's all. Super easy. You have BTI in it, so you don't have to dump this out every week, but I suggest dumping the water out weekly and replenishing it so that you are ensuring that every single mosquito larvae dies, because that's the whole goal, is to get rid of the mosquitoes by getting rid of the larvae, because it's easier to control larvae in a container habitat like this than it is to control the adults that are flying around. And make sure you have enough water. I see examples of these online all the time where it's just packed with hay or grass, and there's really not a lot of water. Mosquitoes are looking for a large amount of water. So if they can't really access the water well, they're probably going to look for a different habitat. So if you're looking at the lower left picture, that's about the right amount of plant matter that you need in there. It's maybe just a handful. It's not very much that you need to make this attractive habitat. And you could put these in multiple places around your yard. If you live in a more urban setting or in a place where you don't have a yard to put out a large 5-gallon bucket, something like a to-go soup cup is enough. You could just put it on a windowsill, and that will still attract the mosquitoes. And then again, every week, just dump out that water, add new water. If you're using the bits, put more BTI bits in. If you're using the dunk, you could just take it out and then put it back in after you let out the water. And that's how simple it is. That's it. But you have to check on it. If you don't check on it and all your BTI dissolves, then you're going to have just this perfect habitat that is going to produce more and more mosquitoes in your yard, which is what you don't want. And we have about 6 minutes left. So does anybody have any questions? This is my email address, parkera10@nku.edu. So anytime you have questions, feel free to email me. Jesse asked, does BTI adversely affect tadpoles? No, BTI only affects mosquitoes, black flies, and fungus gnat larvae. So it's very, very specific. That's why we suggest using it. And it's not a chemical, it's a naturally occurring substance. Basically, what happens is when the mosquito larvae eat that bacteria, the bacteria is spiky and it actually pierces through the lining of their stomach, which is what kills them. Oh, that's a great question. Is there a mosquito species that is inherently worse than others? It depends on where you live around the world. So I would say if you live in Africa, for example, the Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit malaria are worse. If you live in India, for example, though, where dengue is a major problem, then Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, which transmit dengue, are worse. So it really depends on where you live. But I think they're all terrible except for the elephant mosquito. Some mosquitoes don't transmit any diseases to us, but getting bit by them and having the allergic reaction and the itchy bump is still annoying. Is there a case where mosquitoes actually benefit you? So that's a really interesting question. There has been some research that disease ecologists have been looking at where we're actually starting to figure out that not the mosquitoes themselves, but the diseases they transmit actually help to keep some ecosystems in check. And so there might be some benefit for them, but for humans in particular, they're not really helping us at all. So not great for us. So I've never actually been to Brazil in particular, but some of the species that are invasive in Brazil, like Aedes albopictus, we also have in northern Kentucky. So, and I've also worked with Aedes aegypti, which is also an invasive species down there. So I have worked with some of the species that you have in Brazil, especially the ones that are causing, like transmitting dengue and things like that, but not in Brazil.
Mhm.
I would love to go to Brazil.
So if any more questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I just wanted to, there is a question that just came, but Allison, this has been so amazing. And I want to thank you so much for all the information about the different kinds of pesticides, insecticides that you can use, because my husband is doing research in the Amazon. He's actually leaving on Saturday. And he asked me, like, what should I use? And I didn't know about permethrin and actually putting it on your clothing. That's such a great idea. So I will share that to him when we have lunch today. So thank you.
Yeah.
Christopher Anderson just asked, what are your thoughts about using genetically modified mosquitoes for gene drives? That is a really great question. You can't answer it in 2 minutes, but go ahead.
I am overall pro genetically modified mosquitoes.
Well, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Any specific rain garden plants? It really depends on where you live, right? So we want to use native plants that are native to your region or your area, because we don't want to introduce non-native plants, and the native plants will do better anyways. So I would look up just native, plants of wherever you're living, that are good for, or, are flood water tolerant, or, water tolerant, depending on where you live. And then whatever comes up, you can even look up, there might be some government agencies that have suggestions, or universities, for example, will sometimes have suggestions on what plants to use in your region.
Well, it's 12:59. And on behalf of all the participants that are listening today, Dr. Parker, I want to thank you so much for such an interesting presentation, and for your insights and everything else that you have provided for us today. Cassie, would you like to say the last words today?
Again, thank you very much, Allison. We really appreciated it. There's so many great questions. I think we'll have them in the chat, but I believe our next webinar is in August. We take the month of July off because of the Globe annual meeting. So we'll see everybody back here August 10th. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much, Dr. Parker.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great to see you again. And I hope to see you at a meeting sometime this year.